joining us. So I'm Tom Brake. I am the Director of Unlock Democracy. And I'm very pleased that today we're going to have as our speaker Clive Betts, who many of you will know is both not only a long-serving but also very well-respected Member of Parliament, someone who has probably more knowledge of local government matters than I would suggest any other Member of Parliament, and served as a government whip under the Labour government, but more recently than that as the chair of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, which of course also means that he's on the liaison committee, so occasionally has opportunities to quiz the Prime Minister as well. Before I call Clive to speak, I'm just going to say a few words about Unlock Democracy. Many of you may know Unlock Democracy perhaps slightly better as Charter 88. That is what our predecessor organisation was called. And we pursue the same agenda as Charter 88 did, in that our objective, our long-term objective, is to secure a written constitution for the United Kingdom, but we campaign on a range of issues, including proportional representation, for transparency and accountability of government, but also significantly, I think, for today's event, for devolution. As an organisation, we're not aligned to any political party. We have members of our organisation, because you can join Unlock Democracy, who are members of all political parties, and equally we have members who are members of no political party. So we're not aligned to a particular party. But it was because of Unlock Democracy's interest in devolution that we commissioned the research from De Montfort University that is the subject of today's discussion. And what this research did was look at the past 40 years of local government and how that had been affected by different governments. And some weeks ago, when we were launching this locally in another borough, a Conservative councillor said, well, surely this is just an opportunity to attack the present government. In fact, that's not the case. What the research shows, unfortunately, is that there has been a pretty consistent direction of travel away from local authorities holding power and responsibility that really started in the late 1970s. So it's not particularly a problem with this government. It's equally been a problem with the coalition government, the Labour government before that, and the Conservative government before that. So, and I hope that Clive may confirm that, his view of what has happened. So it's not just a recent problem that has happened with local government, but a much more long-standing one than that. So we've had a series of local launches. So we've launched this research in places as varied as Sutton, Portsmouth, Hillingdon, Sheffield. We're doing the parliamentary launch. We launched in Oxford, and we are doing a launch in Birmingham soon. So we've tried to get around the country. And you may have spotted there are no Welsh or Scottish towns or cities I've mentioned. That's because the research focuses very much on England. So what does the research show? Well, the research shows, and for those of you who follow local government matters closely, you'll be very familiar with this. The research shows that the UK is one of the most centralised countries in the OECD. And in the report, which I will, Local Government in England, 40 Years of Decline, for instance, if you look at page 9 of the report and look at the graph that shows the country ranking of local autonomy, you will find that the UK is down in the bottom quarter in terms of local autonomy that is given to local councils or local communities. If you look later on in this report on page 34, there is a graph that shows that in the UK, the size of the local authorities is in fact the largest of any local authority covered in, or any country covered in this graph, shows that the size of the local authorities in the UK are the largest. So not only do we have significantly less autonomy in the UK than in most other countries in the OECD, but we also have local authorities that are much larger in size. So in fact, less representation perhaps than most, in fact, according to this graph, any other country that was covered in the OECD. So that's the backdrop against which significant decisions are being taken. And another graph, which doesn't actually appear in our report, but looked at the satisfaction across Europe with the way COVID was handled in each country. It's interesting that the level of satisfaction with the way COVID was handled matched shadowed the graph for the level of local autonomy in each country. So the more local autonomy there was, the more satisfied people were in their respective country about the way COVID was handled. And presumably that is because the local decisions, people could see them, could understand why they were being taken, and perhaps felt more involved in taking those local decisions than in places that were highly centralized. So what the report shows is that, first of all, local government has no constitutional protection. And that is something of interest to Unlock Democracy, because we want a written constitution which would include in it clear delineation of the powers of local government, so that in future national governments couldn't come in and simply take away responsibilities. The report shows that the central government has the use of a large number of tools to control what local government does. Local government often has responsibility without power, and school places would be a very good example of that, where local authorities are responsible for ensuring sufficient provision of school places, but without actually having any control over admissions, making it very difficult to provide the right level of school places. And also often lines of accountability are now quite unclear in the way that services are delivered. Now, we also conducted a survey. In fact, the survey was conducted since the research was published of local councillors. 440 responded, I'm very pleased to say, and they were cross-party, so there were a significant chunk of those councillors were Conservative councillors, and the survey found that 88% of local councillors, and that was 61% of the Conservative councillors who responded, felt that central government had too much power. And the figures for the level of dissatisfaction, for instance, over planning, were equally strong in terms of councillors of all parties being very unhappy at proposals that would see central government dictating to a great extent how planning matters were going to be resolved. And that may well be clearly something that Mr. Jenrick has picked up, and hence perhaps the recent reports that suggest that they're going to move away from the proposals of zoning. So we launched a campaign on the back of this research, which has encouraged councillors to sign up to a simple agenda, which is that they will support more financial autonomy for local councils, more responsibility, and support the idea that there should be an inquiry into the relationship between local and national government to ensure that it became a relationship of equals rather than a relationship perhaps of parent and child, where the parent told its child what to do and the child really had no ability to influence decisions. So I think that's probably enough in terms of what we're doing. Of course, the purpose of this campaign, and indeed the purpose of the research, was to try to influence the government at the point when the government were talking about a devolution white paper. But that's gone by the by, and now it's possibly there may be a levelling up white paper, and there may be an opportunity to influence that. But I think the impact of that is going to be less than had the government come forward with a devolution white paper. So I think I'll stop there in terms of our research and also the campaign that we're running. And it's now with great pleasure that I'm going to hand over to Clive, who, as I said, is extremely knowledgeable in these matters. We're very lucky to have him with us, and he will speak for 10-15 minutes, and then there'll be time, hopefully 20-25 minutes of questions. Please put your questions in the chat, but Clive has to leave us at 10 to 12, so that's the timetable that we're working to. So Clive, thank you for coming, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me to this session on something that I do feel passionate about. I first became a local councillor in Sheffield in 1976 because, like other local councillors, I felt being a councillor meant I was able to make a difference to the community I represented and the people who live within it. I still feel as passionately about that and the commitment to local government now as I did then. I think the truth, however, is, and you were right to point out, this isn't just a criticism of this government, that over the years, councillors have always been more committed to local democracy than governments and MPs. Within Parliament, it's probably true to say that backbenchers are more interested in this than government ministers. And certainly, and I think there's an absolute truth in this, that when in opposition, parliamentarians are always more committed to devolving powers, and suddenly they seem to get less enthusiastic when they get into government. And that's true right the way through. I read the report that you mentioned, Local Government in England, with great interest. I think it was really stimulating, raised a lot of really important issues. I agree with the thrust of the report, as I will indicate, and the principles it espouses, though probably not with every detail. And I'll just raise one or two issues where perhaps I have a slightly different point of view as we go along. I think what the report sets out very properly is that over the last 40 years, and I say just about coincides with my time as an elected representative from 1976, that's 45 years, about the same period, removal of powers from local government, and I'll just talk about one or two of those, increasing direction from the centre about how the powers local government does have should be administered. So essentially it's more of an administration arrangement than a real choice for councils about what they do. Increasing controls over the revenue that councils can raise, cuts to the money they get from the centre, and restrictions on what that money can be used for. And then we have outsourcing as well, with the actual delivery of services taken away from councils. I think 5 issues there, removal of powers, increasing controls, restrictions on funding being raised, cuts to the money that's been handed out, and how it can directions how it can be spent, and then outsourcing as well. Just going through a few of those issues in order. Removal of powers. Well, there's so many areas, and I'm sure everyone could think of their own areas where things 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago could be done by councils, but they can't be done anymore. But let's just take schools, for example. Schools used to be a responsibility of local councils. I remember a time when councils decided school budgets. They could even direct schools how they what curriculum they taught. They put their governors on school governing bodies. It's completely different now, isn't it? Academies have come in. No evidence at all that academies actually deliver better education and better outcomes. But there was this idea that councils were all the reason why we have problems in education. Further education completely removed from councils now, though some arguments about bringing them back under the remit of combined authorities. So that's a major area, and of course the funding of councils now, as schools become academies, just passport it straight through to the schools. No say for councils at all to have in that. Housing, which I'm particularly interested in from the select committee, and certainly from area back as chair of housing in Sheffield in the 1980s. The right to buy, directing councils what they can do with their own assets, irrespective of housing need in their areas, and then when they're sold, of course, directing councils what they can do with the receipts or can't do with the receipts when the money is raised from the sales. Private sector, councils some powers now to license private sector housing, but only if the government approves. So a bit of power, but only if it's agreed by the Secretary of State. Again, why? The Secretary of State doesn't know anything about the localities, in particular local authority areas, the particular needs and how they need addressing. And it's this idea that somehow the centre and a few civil servants down there in Whitehall, because it's civil servants in the end, isn't it, rather than Secretary of State who can't possibly know all these things, have got a better understanding and knowledge than locally elected councillors. Controls on revenue. I mean, this is some of the worst issues, and you just look back at when I became a councillor in the 70s. Councils decided on their own rates, both domestic and non-domestic, the level at which money was raised from residents and from businesses in their area. We then went on to rate capping, and I certainly lived through all that area of central government attempting to control what councils could raise. It went on, of course, to the poll tax and then council tax. Well, that might be better than the poll tax, but of course it's controlled. I mean, look at the council tax now. We had council tax capping, following rate capping, under a Labour government, I have to say, and I refused to vote for many instances of council tax capping under the Labour government. We've now got, councils can nominally raise council tax to whatever they want, except they've got to have a referendum to do it. And that referendum level is set by the Secretary of State. So really complete controls. It's the only form of revenue councils have any control over, yet the bands are fixed by central government, and the valuation of the properties is back to 1991. I mean, it is a nonsense of a tax, really. And of course, for business rates, the level of business rates controlled by the centre, and most of the money still goes to the centre and is redistributed. We have councils in this country have less control over the money, over raising money and how they raise it than almost any other councils in Western democracies. I think some reform of that is incredibly badly needed. Some greater controls for councils over the taxation which they nominally control. And that's something that we've looked at as a select committee before and made recommendations on. And then, of course, the fact that most money comes from central government, the cuts in funding have been dramatic and have really restricted what councils can do and forced them into cuts to services they would otherwise want to bring about. Local councils have had bigger cuts to their money than any other part of the public sector in the last 10 years. And with the cuts have also come, over the years, ring fencing of budgets. Though, to be fair to the Conservative government, they began to remove some of those in the initial coalition period. But now we haven't got ring fencing, we've got bidding pots. So instead of having blocks of money that councils can strategically decide how to spend and bring in their own priorities, what we have is pots of money. I mean, multiple pots of money, all disconnected, all with independent criteria, but in the end decided by the Secretary of State about who should get the money and how it should be spent. That isn't democracy and isn't actually the way that services should properly be delivered at a local level. And on top of that, we've had outsourcing in various forms. We had compulsory competitive tendering, and then because councils couldn't raise the capital because there are capital restrictions, they have been lifted by this government, and that's very welcome with the prudential borrowing requirement. We had the PFI brought in so that councils could get some capital spending done, but of course all the controls on PFI that come with it in terms of the outsourcing to private companies on very restrictive terms. Just say one or two areas I don't completely agree with the report. I'm not against the cabinet system, I have to say. I think it can actually give greater powers to councillors, maybe to some councillors, but with proper scrutiny, and scrutiny isn't always properly done, and that's down to councils themselves, that there can be greater power for councillors. For example, you can't delegate to council cabinet, to committee chairs under a non-cabinet system. You can delegate powers to cabinet members. Under a committee system, you can only delegate to individual officers. I think that is a problem. Size of councils, I don't completely agree with the comments there. I think you can have large councils which do connect with their communities, but it's down to councils to actually devolve powers within their areas. Devolution shouldn't stop at the town hall door. I think that's a very worthwhile phrase we've used in a previous report from the Select Committee. Local plans, I think, are really an important tool for councils. I would criticise councils sometimes for not getting on and keeping their plans up to date, even when they have the resources. Between the period between 2000 and 2010, councils often delayed in getting local plans in place. And central government couldn't be blamed for that. But the planning reforms are now being suggested, and you're right to mention those. They were a negation of local democracy by taking the powers away from councils and local people to comment properly on individual planning applications. And just to say, there does need to be a balance and a proper working relationship between central and local government. Just some examples. We need to build 300,000 homes a year in this country. So it's right that there has to be some allocation of numbers between council areas, but an understanding how that's done. So the total adds up to the 300,000. On climate change, we do need a national framework. It is a national challenge, but councils have to be an incredibly important part of delivering the policies that are going to deliver climate change and hit our national targets. We need central and local government working together. COVID, you mentioned, Tom, absolutely right. You know, the way that the country responded to COVID would have been much better, for example, on tracking and tracing, if public health directors had been left in charge of it, rather than the call centres that the government established at national level. We needed a national framework with local government required, yes, but enabled to play a much bigger role in those arrangements. So where should we go to from here? Yes, Parliament's always going to be sovereign in this country, but we do need, I think, a very high-profile Local Government Act, which sets out a framework of powers which councils are entitled to use, with councils deciding which powers they want to take. Not been handed out like sweets, as you say, to children from the Secretary of State's desk. We need things done locally, unless there is a good reason why they shouldn't be. Let's turn the argument round. Not what should be devolved, but what should be done centrally. And if it doesn't need to be done centrally, it should be done locally. We need subsidiarity, and that's within local councils as well. Which level of council should we devolve things to? Things don't just have to be devolved to new combined authorities, for example. They can be devolved to individual councils, and councils can devolve, as I say, within their boundaries. We need a major reform of local government finance. We need relaxation on the restrictions on council tax. But perhaps we just need to think about a whole new form of property tax, which is fair and more up to date and less regressive for both residents and businesses. We need to look at other sources of funding. Mentions have been made of tourism tax, but most of those are not going to raise a lot of money in most areas. So maybe councils have a right to a certain percentage of a national tax. That's something that happens in many other countries like Denmark, for example. It's something we could do. The challenge we have to answer is, well, of course, people say it's a postcode lottery then. Depends where you live, what you get. Well, yes, but that's one of the strengths. It isn't not simply about a postcode lottery, which we have now to an extent, but a postcode choice. Councils have been able to choose with the backing of their local residents on the basis of local elections what they do. And that may be different in different parts of the country. But if you go to the National Health Service, it's a national service, but please don't pretend that it's the same level of service in every part of the country. Depending where you live, you get different attention. If you live in a major city and you have a stroke on a Monday morning, you've got more chance of survival than if you live in a rural area and have a stroke on a Sunday night. That's simply what happens, and so we shouldn't pretend it's any different to that. And if you look at the idea that somehow if you have centralization, get equality, we are one of the most unequal countries in terms of regional differences than any other country in Europe. We're also one of the most centralized. So centralization doesn't bring equality in any meaningful sense. And we are going to need, of course, because of the current inequality, a central government funding mechanism that addresses that. So more power for local councils to raise money, But recognising the inequality of the resource base that councils have, then we're still going to need some equalisation mechanism from the centre as well. So we're just going to launch a devolution report as a select committee next week. I can't say what will be in it, but perhaps I've given an indication of some of the issues that have been raised with us. We're going to have the levelling up report, as you say, from government. What that will do, nobody knows. Let's hope it's a bit more ambitious than some of us might pessimistically think it might be. But in the end, we've got to keep pressing on this. I really welcome the report you've done. It's an important addition to a very important debate, and I look forward to working with you on this in the future. Thanks very much, Tom.
Thank you very much, Clive, for a real sort of tour de force history lesson and bring us up to date in terms of what's happening from a local government perspective. Now, I have encouraged people to put questions in the chat, and while I wait for that, I will kick off with perhaps a few questions of my own. And the first one being, what opportunities do you see, if any, in Parliament over the next 12 months, say, either things that you can initiate, your select committee, or perhaps others, or indeed government legislation, where there will be an opportunity to hopefully strengthen the hand of local government? Or do you think any such opportunities will regrettably be an opportunity to weaken the hand or the strength of local government even further?
I don't really know. I mean, I say we're going to keep on up with the argument, Tom. We're going to have our devolution report, and certainly in the past, all members of the select committee, and I think as you will obviously know, there are 11 members of the select committee, there are 6 Conservative, 5 Labour, and we've always been very supportive of the principles of devolution and support for local councils. I think it partly depends on what the levelling up report says and whether government really wants to be ambitious. Unfortunately, so far, you know, what levelling up has amounted to is a series of these different pots, as I mentioned, which are not about localism or local democracy. They're about government handing out the sweetest, and you know, often in a very obscure way, how it's decided which areas get the money, and they're all separate, so they aren't joined up in a way that councils can really deal with the fundamental problems that exist, particularly in the poorer communities. And the difficulty is, whenever government gets into problems on any issue, its knee-jerk reaction is always to start directing what councils need to do. So I'm not optimistic about fundamental change in the next year. But I am optimistic there will be many of us who are pushing for that change. And just to mention as well, there's an all-party group on local democracy, which Andrew Lower, a Conservative member of Parliament, chaired, and that's produced a report recently as well. I think a very forthright, direct, and positive report, raising the challenge of the need for more local democracy. So there are many things going on in Parliament. We just need to keep the pressure on.
Thank you. A further question. You set out, and indeed our report does as well, that the changes that have happened to local government. Would you be arguing for simply all of those changes that have happened over the last 20, 30 years to be restored? Or do you see a model of local government that can deliver much better for the needs of local communities, but without perhaps trying to recreate the same structures, rules, financial arrangements that applied 30 or 40 years ago?
I wouldn't necessarily go back simply and switch over, though there are things I would change. I would certainly give councils more power over education issues. I just don't understand why it's thought that academy trusts, often based completely outside their areas, can make better decisions for local children than councils can. I really don't understand that. I've never seen the logic of it. Sorry, just the bell for the start of parliamentary proceedings is going off. Right, so I would, on the other hand, I wouldn't probably go back to the micromanaging of schools on a day-to-day basis. That used to happen. I think it certainly did happen back in the 70s and 80s. So I think there's a move back, but not probably quite to where we were before, just on education. So that's simply one area. I mentioned licensing private housing. Councils didn't have much control over it at all in the 1970s, but there wasn't as much private housing, of course. It had almost gone to non-existence then. So I think, changing that to bring in proper controls and regulation of the private sector, which councils would do, I think is something where councils could be strengthened compared with where they were some years ago. But in the end, I think it's down to councils to come out and argue the case, not just for me sitting in Parliament to say what council should have. And sometimes I don't think local government has come out and clearly stated what it thinks the powers are that it should have over what areas. And if we move to a devolution framework, the sort I'd like to see, where powers are available for councils as of right, then the LGA and other bodies have got to state more clearly, in my view, what powers they think that council should have.
Thank you. We're starting to get some other questions, which is great news. So we've got one from Jim Stanker. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And Jim's question is, how do we try and get better cooperation between local authorities and metropolitan combined authorities stroke mayors to address the regional inequalities that you referred to?
Well, I think that there's arguments about whether we need mayors or not. I wasn't convinced to begin with. I think there have been some merits. Certainly, the combined authorities. I think it was probably better to have an elected mayor than another level of elected councillors. And I think we should get the mayors to work together to argue the case, particularly for the more deprived areas. So I don't think it's about inequalities between the various areas with mayors currently. It's about the fact that most of the combined authorities are areas which are generally poorer and less well resourced than other parts of the country. But within the combined authorities, there are differences there in terms of the level of prosperity, the level of poverty that exists. And I think that is something where the mayor and the leaders of those authorities need to work together. Again, it's an issue that's been raised with us about whether the whether the workings of the combined authorities are always as transparent as they might be. And there's a feeling sometimes that policies sort of emerge without a great deal of public debate or public scrutiny. So I think it's something we'll be looking at in our report on devolution, the whole issue of the scrutiny of combined authorities and how those issues about how they deal with the challenge of inequalities can actually be properly addressed with public support. So I think there's still there's a lack of understanding of the public about what's going on and a lack of engagement, which I think is a concern.
A further related question, which you partially answered, but you might want to add a little bit to it, and that's from Victor Kadaksa from Tyne and Weir, which is, do you think mayors of conurbations plus are a positive or negative development?
I think that there is the combined authorities were a useful means to start some move towards increasing local democracy. The reality was, and we had evidence taken, and Greg Clark who was the main mover along with George Osborne towards the creation of the combined authorities when he was Minister and Secretary of State. I mean, he made the point, I think, that the Treasury was very resistant to giving money to council because they just wasted it, didn't they? I mean, it's ridiculous. You only have to look at the last 10 years and local governments made more efficiency savings than almost the whole of central government combined. They've managed the cuts incredibly well, not without pain, but incredibly well. So the Treasury was resistant. So the deal system of creating the combined authorities was perhaps the only way you were going to start to move towards getting some powers out of the centre and into local areas. That was probably necessary. I think they have been, on balance, positive. I think they have given a focus for the needs of local areas. I think Andy Burnham's spat with the government over some of the COVID regulations was high profile. and probably gave a particular profile to what the combined authorities can do to speak on behalf of their communities. It's not just about powers, it's voice, which I think is a really important issue as well. So on balance, I think also they pulled together wider areas where there is a need for a wider look at economies. The individual councils can't always look at travel to work areas, at the economic hinterland around major cities. And I think Manchester is a very good example of that, where the authorities have worked really well together over a time and have got a combined approach to their local economy. So I think in that sense they've been good. On the other hand, I think we are slipping back now from the idea that combined authorities represented local economies into simply sticking to the old historic administrative boundaries. And that sometimes isn't always the right way to go. So I think there have been positives, albeit they were created out of necessity, because you've never got the Treasury to agree to anything without them.
Thank you very much, Clive. A question from Vicky Seddon, who you will know. That is, very few people seem to know about the degree to which monies have been cut from local authorities, resulting in deteriorating local services. How can we get our media to give this more attention? Or are we just in a situation where, because local authorities have fewer powers, there is less interest in them from the media? How do we address this?
I think there's an element of truth, and hello, Vicky. I should have said hello to Jim Steinke as well. We know each other from Sheffield. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Vicky. I think the problem is that the councils are seen as less important in some ways because they're doing less of the things that people want to see at local area, and people I think are increasingly of the view. Well, what does it matter? Because whatever happens, they're just going to make cuts, and they really haven't got much power to do anything else, have they? And there's an element of truth in that, isn't there? So I think that's a real worry. One of the things that, if I just put one I think really dangerous change that's happening, is that we know that councils have had a 30% cut in their spending power since 2010. That's a massive amount of money. We know that they've had to spend more of their budgets on social care, even though the real term spending on social care has fallen slightly, but therefore they've had to make even bigger cuts to all the other services they provide, the libraries, the parks, the street cleaning, the buses, the things that everybody receives to some degree. So if you're someone who doesn't get social care, and you see your council tax going up 5% every year, and you see your local library closed, and the grass in your parks overgrown, and the swings not replaced, and the local bus service cut, and the streets not being swept as well, then you think, well, I'm actually paying more and getting less. What's the point of these councils? And you're right, a lot of people simply do not understand the extent to which councils rely on central government funding, and the extent to which that has been cut, and therefore the limits to what councils can do. And my worry is that the whole support for local democracy will actually be diminished, not because the councils are doing a bad job, but actually because central government is putting them in that position. And I think you're absolutely right. I think you put your finger absolutely on it, Vicky.
Thank you, Clive. A further question, this time from Anne Kingdom. Have some changes become so entrenched that they would be much harder to reverse than others, e.g. academy trusts or public sector not building very much housing? So where are the best opportunities to start to take away central government control and restore a bit of local autonomy? Where should we start?
It's a really good question. I think on education, I don't think we can simply abolish all the academy trusts. Indeed, sometimes reorganisations are so disruptive that you think, what was the point of doing them? I think you could start to give councils an oversight over the funding. You could give the role of schools commissioners. Why can't that be done? by elected councils. I think you could start to bring back some oversight of academies, if not necessarily to simply abolish all the academies overnight. You know, the issues like the use of school facilities for the community. Some academies are simply lock communities out. We will get all those sorts of things changed and challenged, I'm sure. On housing, for example, yeah, we can get back to councils building housing, and some are starting to build them. We've started a house building programme in Sheffield now with the council doing it. And very simply, again, I talked about the need for central and local government to work together on things. If we are going to build 300,000 homes a year in this country, then councils and housing associations are going to have to build a significant number of those. As a select committee, we said at least 90,000 have got to be built by public sector organisations. The reason why we've only very rarely, back I think to the 1970s and a few years, even earlier, built 300,000 homes a year. And when we've done it, the public sector's always built a high percentage of those. The private sector cannot be entrusted, cannot be believed to be going to deliver 300,000 homes by itself. So we are going to need council house building programmes if we're going to hit the national targets. Government's going to need councils at some point. I think they're just starting to recognise that. But of course, what they haven't recognised is the need to give councils the funding to do that. We said that councils would need, or the housing associations and councils would need about £10 billion a year to build that number of homes. The government's offered £12 billion over a 4 to 5 year period.
Okay, next question from Judy Seymour. Do you think community wealth building is an effective route to building local democracy and addressing some of the deficits you outline? And you might want to explain community wealth building in case there are people on the call who don't know what it is.
Well, perhaps could the questioner just explain a little bit more what she thinks that means, so I'm on the right track. Right.
Let's let Judy Seymour in if she's happy to expand on her question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Judy.
Great. I understand it to be a way of taking back control to the local area by specifically by very local solutions. So it's been trialled in Preston, found to be very successful. A lot of people are very interested in it. A very interesting book has just come out called Paint Your Town Red, which I very much recommend people reading. But one of the main lessons from that is that there's no one size fits all model. What you need to do is look at your local area and look at where your strengths lie and build on your strengths rather than adopting a model that's worked somewhere else. And the other learning that seems to be coming out of it is that if it's going to really take root, it needs to be built from the bottom up and not be attached to any one political party, so that changes in administration don't disrupt it. It's very much addressing the issue of ownership. So it looks at cooperative models of ownership. It looks at another way of doing it is to certainly use the council's power of contracting. What's the term? It's not commissioning, it's not contracting. It's when a council writes a contract, commissions a service, and writing into the contract requirements, local priorities, and looking at ways to ensure that local businesses have a fair opportunity to bid for that work. So it's really about building the local economy, looking at accountability, connection, quality of service, responsiveness to local needs.
Yeah, thank you, Judy. Clive.
Well, I think that's almost answered the question as well as I asked it, but I think, yeah, it's absolutely positive, yes, and I think we've all read with interest what's happening in Preston, but as you rightly say, Judy, it's about different areas forming their own solutions, but it seems a very good example, a very good model that other areas could follow. And you're absolutely right, contracting of itself is not necessarily completely bad, but how the contracting is done is absolutely key, and councils have got a right not just to go for the lowest price on a tender, which often they do, and you often find the people writing the contract are not the same people who are responsible for delivering the service in a council. You can write it in such a way that that benefits to the whole community by local businesses and local community groups being able to provide services are actually taken into account when tenders are assessed. And so sometimes the blame isn't just down to central government, it's down that councils not always using their approach and their powers. But something else we were looking at yesterday when we took evidence on climate change is local generation of local power, renewable energy, and how that can fit into local communities. And how that can be done by communities and benefit themselves. And, you know, combined heat and power schemes. We've had one in Sheffield for many, many years where heat is generated locally and serves local housing and local businesses. So there are many examples, and that follows on from what's happening in other countries. Let's look what happened in Hamburg, how they've developed local businesses and local energy schemes as well. So sometimes we just get focused on this country when there's actually a lot of good lessons we can learn from elsewhere as well.
Thank you, Clive. A question, or one of the questions from Alan Debenham, which is how do you address the fact that in his area, for instance, there are 100 parish and town councils, but less than 10 of them actually have contested parish elections. In other words, there's no real democracy because no one is actually taking the trouble to take part in it. So how do you build an interest, particularly perhaps at a parish and district level, in what those councils are doing?
I wouldn't pretend to be able to answer that with any great knowledge. My constituency hasn't got any parishes. We've got very few in Sheffield, but I do recognise in some areas they play a very important role. And I'd be interested in what Alan had to say, because obviously he's down there in Taunton. He probably has a much better understanding, I'm sure he does, of what's needed in his area than I do. I think that's one of the dangers of trying to prescribe what should be done. It's up to each area. I mean, in some areas, you know, more powers can be given to local parishes, where particularly the larger ones, maybe to deliver local services. Like you know, street cleaning, grass cutting, all the things that are done on a very hands-on day-to-day basis. And maybe if the parish controls those and has a parish rate which they can raise to improve those services, then people get more interested locally. But that's an off-the-top comment, not said with any great understanding of what actually happens in areas with parishes.
Thank you. A question from Marisha Ray, and I'm hoping we're going to be able to get through the remaining sort of 3 or 4, although people keep adding to the chat. But the question from Marisha is, when is it best to have unitary authorities and when not?
I think that's in the end down to local areas. I have to say I probably, and I'm going to put my foot right in it now, generally have a support for unitaries. I think it's clearer when there is one council rather than more than one council about what's public's understanding of things. Having said that, combined authorities, of course, are another layer of local government, but there's not another layer of councillors, there's just a mayor. I think it will get confusing if we established combined authorities on county structures where you've got districts, counties, combined authorities and parishes. I don't know whether that is over government, though somebody will no doubt tell me other countries have more complicated systems than that. But I don't know. I think you've got to make the case, and I think there should be local decision making. If we're in favour of local democracy, then local democracy has to extend to how local democracy should operate in each area.
I think what you're highlighting is that we're all in favour of devolution, but once you start to discuss the detail, then it gets slightly more problematic. Yes. A question from Sandra, and that is, given that local solutions will provide a positive impact on the climate crisis, should that be used as an argument, I guess, to increase power for local government?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And again, I can't anticipate the report we're going to produce after the parliamentary recess about climate change. But you know, one thing we know is that homes generate a lot of carbon emissions, probably around 16%, I think it is, of carbon emissions in this country. We know that we're going to have to replace all gas boilers, though the Prime Minister seemed a bit surprised when we asked him at the liaison committee the other day, by the mid-2030s, if we're going to hit our climate change targets. We also know that if that's going to be done properly with local involvement and local education and local persuasion, that councils are going to have to play a key role in that. So yes, if we're going to deliver those changes alongside all the changes needed to deal with vehicle emissions, councils are going to be key in that process.
And perhaps the final question, Clive, which may be the question on which we disagree most, but we've had a lot of agreement so far, and this is a question from Alan Debenham. We need PR voting in all elections, especially at local council level. What's your view?
My view is that one of the strengths of our democracy in this country is people elect a local councillor and a local MP who they know represents them and is there and available to deal with issues in their area. I think people talk about PR and then you just talk, Tom, about we're all in favour of local democracy, and then we can have arguments about what form of local democracy we mean. So all the people in favour of PR, I get them in a room and they all have disagreements about what PR actually means and what form they want it to take.
Well, that's probably a good point to finish, and good also because there are we've left people with an appetite for more. Unfortunately, there are other questions we haven't been able to pick up on, but thank you, Clive. Is there anything you'd like to say just as concluding remarks?
No, all I would say is keep the arguments going. As you say, there are one or two areas where we don't see completely eye to eye, Tom, but there's so many areas that we do. And I think just a commitment and a belief that in local democracy and local councillors, and a view that they can deliver better for their communities, and in the end, by doing that, we can create a better and fairer country for us all to live in. Well, those are very good words to finish the event with. So thank you very much, Clive. Pleasure having you with us and for your support. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to everyone else on the call. If you're not already members of Unlock Democracy, but were interested in joining, very simple to do that. Go on to unlockdemocracy.org.uk. Easy to sign up as a member. And as you all have hopefully picked up from this webinar, that we are very active on the subject of devolution, pressing for local communities to be given a much greater say in addressing their needs. And much less centralisation. So thank you for joining us. We will be having other events on similar subjects in the future. So do join us for those as well. And finally, again, my apologies to the people whose questions we didn't have time to deal with. But as I said, there may well be opportunities to raise those in other events. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.